Well, that was convenient. I was going to ask him to come lead a prayer. We need to go ahead and get started this morning. I'm going to shut the doors back there. And Napoleon, would you like to come lead us in an opening prayer this morning? Go ahead and stand, please.
This morning, our Heavenly Father, we come before you with bowed heads and our hearts. Thank you again for another day that you have kept us. Father, we just want to say thank you for this week. Thank you for your grace, your mercies. Thank you for watching over us all week long. Father, as we go into our service, that we go in with the open heart and the will of mind, so we can gather the things that we need to go out into the world to be the light of the world. These are the blessings we ask in your Son, Jesus' name, for our sake. Amen.
We are in Romans chapter 3. We're going to be starting around verse 9 this morning. You want to be turning over there. Here in chapters, beginning in verse 18 of 1 and all of chapter 2 and up till now in chapter 3, Paul is making a case. He's making a case that everyone is under condemnation because of sin. No exceptions to that. The Gentiles don't have an exception just because they did not have a special revelation from God giving them a law. They knew enough. And he's also telling the Jews, you don't have an exception. Just because you had the law does not excuse you. You're still guilty because none of you have upheld the law. You've all sinned under the law. And so he's been making that case. Here at the beginning of chapter 3, the first 8 verses that we looked at last week, he was answering some objections that the Jews had to his proposition here. And so he's going to conclude that here, starting in verse 9, this section here. Verse 9, he says, here, what shall we conclude then? Are we any better? Not at all. We have already made the charge that Jew and Gentile alike are all under sin. So he begins with another question, following the theme he had in the first 8 verses here. What shall we conclude then? He's telling them, I'm going to bring this argument now to a close. I want you to think about everything I've said up till now and put it all together. And he asks another question after that. Are we any better? And people ask, who is the we that Paul's talking about? Whoever it is, he's including himself in that. Some say he's referring to Christians, while some say he's talking to all humanity. But I think he's still talking specifically to the Jews. He was a Jew himself, and I think he's still talking to them. And he's asking the question, are we any better? And his answer to that is no. He says we've already made the charge that Jew and Gentile alike are all under sin. Were there any advantage to being a Jew? You know, he asked that question in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 3 here. He said, what advantage then is there in being a Jew, or what value is there in circumcision? And he said there's a lot. And he says, first of all, we were entrusted with the very words of God. That was a big honor, wasn't it? It did give them an advantage, but did they take advantage of that advantage? Boy, that didn't sound right, did it? Okay. And he's saying, in regard to sin and judgment, though, that advantage did not spill over as it stood in their relationship, their standing before God. Just having the law didn't help them. And so, like the Gentiles, they too stood condemned. Look at verses 10 through 12 now. Starts out, as it is written. He's referring back now. He says, look at some verses in the Old Testament. Let's see what the Old Testament says about this. As it is written, there is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands. There is no one who seeks God. All have turned away. They have together become worthless. There is no one who does good, not even one. Boy, that's a pretty depressing statement, isn't it? He's talking about mankind here. And he says there is no one righteous. I mean, everybody on planet Earth, there's no one righteous enough. Remember the argument that Abraham had with God there, overlooking Sodom and Gomorrah? He bargained with him. Will you spare the city if you can just find 10 righteous people? They couldn't do it, could they? All right? Couldn't do it at all. And so here Paul quotes from the Old Testament. He quotes Psalm 14, 1 through 3. He quotes Psalm 53, 1 through 3. And he quotes Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 2. And he begins by declaring man's sinfulness. There's no one righteous. We all are guilty before God. He's saying, does that mean we never do anything good? No, we do good. Okay. There are good people in this world, aren't there? There are people that they strive to do what's right and do good things. There's just one problem. They're still sinners. They're not consistent. And so they're still guilty before God. And all of our good deeds can't make up for our sins. Because see, what's the penalty for sin? Death. And your good deeds can't make up that difference there. In verse 11, he speaks of men not understanding God or seeking God. Is that God's problem? Did God make it hard for man to seek him, to find him? That's something all religions say, that it's hard to find God. And the first thing you got to do is you got to go out and you got to find God. Kind of like, somebody asked, how do I find, they asked Buddha, how do I find God? And Buddha says, well, first you got to locate what mountain God's on, and then you got to climb up to him. Okay? That's not our God. Our God didn't do that. Our God has made his presence known just in nature itself. Science, somehow we got this idea in our head that science is an enemy of God, or science is an enemy to faith. It's not. It's not. The scientific evidence for the existence of God is incredible. I studied science at a secular university. I don't know if any of my professors believed in God. Quite a few of them were atheists, I can tell you that. And I walked out of that school 4 years later with a stronger faith in God than I went in. And a lot of it had to do with what things I saw in science that scientists can't explain. Some of the scientific evidence for the existence of God, science says that, when you look at science, it says this universe had a beginning and it has an end. For years, scientists believed that this universe was eternal. When it started dawning on them that this universe was not eternal? Not the 1700s, not the 1800s, in the 1960s. Starting 1960, most scientists out there, now when I say scientists, I'm talking about those that observed the heavens and they believed that the universe was eternal. But evidence then, we started coming in that this universe had an actual beginning. And today they don't even really debate it. What they're trying to do is try and find a way to explain that without God, and that leads them to a lot of really strange theories that they can't prove, like the multiverse and things like that. They can't prove any of those things, but they know it had a beginning, and they know this universe is heading towards an end, and that implies a creator. I think that's a very strong argument that there had to have been a creator for this universe to even be here. The more we explore the biological world, the more we're impressed with its complexity. Evolution says life goes from a very simple organism into this complex creature we call a human being. But the more they look at even the simplest life, the more impressed with how complicated it is. It's far more complicated than they believed it was. The fossil record does not support Darwinian evolution. That's a dirty secret in the scientific community and the biological community, is that. DNA is a written language. And you can't have a written language without an author, can you? Okay? I mean, there's just incredible evidence wherever you look for the existence. And here's our problem in the church: we don't teach this. In fact, I hear too many preachers putting science down than actually looking at the actual evidence that there is. And if we did that, I think we'd lose few of our kids once they go to college. Because let me tell you, they're aggressive there in trying to destroy faith. I saw it even when I went to college. I had professors that were there trying to destroy faith. But today, people have to go and study in universities to blind them to these facts. It's really sad. Verse 11, Paul says, no one understands. Why do you think people have a hard time understanding that God is? What blinds them to that fact? How about sin? Sin blinds us to the fact of God. Look at 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 4. Second Corinthians 4, verse 4 says, the God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers, so that they cannot see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is in the image of God. It says right here, the God of this age. Who's that? That's Satan. Has blinded the minds of unbelievers. Sin is the problem. Sin is why people can't see God, why people don't understand God's existence. You know, I've studied with my share of atheists. And I can tell you right now, the issue is not due to a lack of knowledge. They know, okay? Some of them know the Bible pretty good. Their problem is sin. Sin's the number one cause of atheism out there. Look at verse 12. All have turned away. They've all become worthless. There is no one who does good, not even one. Because of man's sin, man turns away from God. You know, this is very similar to what Paul said back in chapter 1, verse 18. Flip back there. Let's look at that again, because this is almost identical. Romans 1, starting in verse 18. Says, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. The evidence is there. The evidence is there. But look what it says. It says, although, verse 21, for although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. What does it mean that their hearts were darkened? What's that? They definitely have sin in their heart, yes. Something else. When you think of someone's heart or mind being dark, what does that speak to you? What does it say to you about that person? Stubborn, did you say? Stubborn. Okay, yeah, they definitely get stubborn. I can tell you that for sure. They just refuse to see it. What else? How about this? Ignorance. It's ignorance. Darkness. When I read about spiritual darkness, I hear ignorance coming from that. They don't understand. Either they don't want to understand, okay? And usually that's the case right there. They don't want to understand. They think they're so smart, but when it comes to God and knowing God, they're ignorant because they don't want to know. The verse turned away, going back to Romans 3:12 here. They have all turned away. Okay, we've all become worthless. The turning away, the idea is similar to how we treat milk when it goes sour. Okay, what do we do with milk? What do you use, don't say buttermilk now, okay? Shh. Okay, there's the door right there. That's not what I wanted to hear, okay? There's always somebody, okay? I knew there was going to be somebody on this, but that's what the Greek word conjures up. Here's the idea of sour milk. It makes it where it's not what you want. It's, and lots of times with sour milk, we dump it down the drain today, don't we? In that. Because of sin, what that is saying is because of sin, we've turned sour as far as God is concerned. And, God created us with a purpose. And that purpose was to glorify Him. And because we have turned sour because of sin, it's ruined that within us. Okay? It's ruined that within us that would be used to glorify God. We can't glorify Him anymore because of our sin. That's what that's saying. And finally, Paul says, there is no one who does good, not even one. Like I said, does this mean that there is no one who ever does good? No, that's not what he's saying. There are morally good men and women who are even atheists. I've known some people who don't believe in God, and they were very, very good people. Morally, there wasn't anything, I couldn't see anything wrong with them. Okay? But see, the problem is, we don't see sin the way God sees sin. We make light of our sin. We try to excuse our sin. And because of that, we don't see it the way God does. Sin spoils that which is good in us. And we may do good things, but that sin comes along and spoils it. And we all sin. And where we might think we're good people, we're not good all the time, are we? We're inconsistent. Okay? Even the best person in the world messes up. Yes, ma'am. We're not good in line with his nature. Yeah, that is true. But here's the thing. Even in our nature, we're not consistent. You might think yourself to be a good person, but you're not consistent with it. That's a problem right there. Verses 13 and 14. He says, their throats are open graves. Their tongue practice deceit. The poison of vipers is on their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. We'll go ahead and read verse 15 too. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Paul here now lays out some practical ways that we sin. And he's quoting again from the Old Testament. He's quoting Psalms 5:9, Psalms 140 verse 3, and Psalms 10 verse 7. What's consistent in all these things Paul just said in 13 through 12? What is the one consistent thing that you see in operation that we're using to sin with? What do you call those parts? Parts of what? Our body. Okay? We use our physical bodies to sin. Temptation develops within our bodies, within our minds, within our desires, and then we act them out with our bodies, don't we? And that's why he says that. The Bible is very consistent. Paul is very consistent about this. Look in Romans chapter 6, verses 12 and 13. Paul says, "Therefore do not let sin reign in your mortal bodies so that you obey its evil desires. Do not offer the parts of your body to sin as instruments of wickedness, but rather offer yourself to God as those who have been brought from death to life, and offer the parts of your body to him as instruments of righteousness." Paul here is saying that we use the parts of our body to sin, but as Christians, we now need to learn to use the parts of our body to glorify God. How do we use our bodies to glorify God today? How can we do that? Okay, using your hands and your feet to go and help other people. You're glorifying God when you do that. How else? We sing praises to God, don't we? We use our mouths to sing praises to God. We use our mouths to tell people about Jesus and to teach them. You know, that's another way we can do it. Paul's saying now we need to retool the way we use things that God has given us. Drop down to verse 19 here in Romans 6. It says, "I put this in human terms, because you are weak in your natural selves, just as you used to offer the parts of your body in slavery to impurity and to ever-increasing wickedness. So now offer them in slavery to righteousness, leading to holiness." There again, he's talking about how we use our bodies. This is a conscious decision we make. We make a decision to sin, don't we? Well, he's saying now you need to learn to make a decision to glorify God instead of committing sin. Go back to Romans 3, verses 13 and 14. I'm sorry. Drop down to verse 15. He said in verse 15, "Their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and misery mark their way, and the way of peace they do not know." Paul here is quoting from Isaiah 59, verses 7 and 8. And I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm right. He points out what sinners do. You know, he refers to their feet. What are their feet doing? Swift to shed blood. Okay? We are violent people. Did you realize that? I don't think we really realize just how violent the human race is. We like to think of ourselves as pretty good people, but think of all the murders you hear about. You know, just violence that people enact upon other people, the wars that take place. We're very violent, okay? And we carry out our evil with eagerness and joy in this, okay? We're swift to shed blood. We run to take, you know, where we go, violence follows in our wake. That's mankind. And I don't think we appreciate how violent we really are. That shocked me when I moved to Russia. We consider ourselves pretty civilized here in America, don't we? It's getting worse here. And I think as we as a nation drifts farther away from God, the violence is going to get worse. I went over to a country that for the last 70 years, the policy of the government is there is no God. And that's why they taught people. And the government treated people like cattle. And so that's how they treated each other. And I just saw a tremendous amount of just violence over there, just living over there. It really shocked me. The world has never known peace, and it never will, as long as sin is present in this world. Verse 17, Paul says, in the way of peace, they do not know. That's mankind. Verse 18, I know we don't like hearing this about ourselves, do we? We like to think about ourselves as pretty good people, don't we? But unfortunately, he's still talking about us. If we let go, if we take our eyes off Christ, and we start living like the world, we drift back into that. It's the nature of man. Verse 18, he says, there is no fear of God before their eyes. Think about that for a second. There's no fear of God before, what does Proverbs 1:7 says? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Okay, we have to learn to fear God. And see, it's saying the reason they don't know God is that they don't fear God. If they knew God, they would fear him, wouldn't they? So what do you mean when we talk about fearing God? What do we mean by that? Giving his due and respect. Okay, somebody else said something? Okay, we like to stop on that, don't we? We don't like to think about fearing God very much. I've noticed that. We ask that question, it goes back to respect. And yes, in one sense, fearing the Lord is about respect. But there's another aspect to fearing God, and that's terror. Okay? If you're not a Christian, you should have more than respect for God. You should respect him, but you better fear him. I wanted my children, as they were growing up, I wanted them to respect me. But there's a few times I actually wanted them to fear me, what I would do if they did certain things. Right, parents? Okay? It's a double-sided sword here in that. Yeah, I believe when you know God and you love God and you're trying to serve God, it comes down to respect. But if you're not doing any of those things, if you live in the world and you're living for yourself and you don't care about God, well, then you better fear him. He better terrify you. Becoming a Christian because you don't want to go to hell is a proper motivation to become a Christian. Paul said in 2 Corinthians, since we know what it is to fear the Lord, we try to persuade men. And I think the fear that he meant there is the fear of judgment and going to hell. And that's something to fear. But in 1 John chapter 4, it says, but perfect love drives out fear. You become a Christian and you start learning about the love of God. It drives that terror away and replaces it with respect. And I think that's the way we need to look at fearing God. Paul says that men suppress the truth by their wickedness. See, that's what sin does operating in the lives of men. It suppresses truth. You wonder why people can't understand the gospel? Sin is the reason for that. Romans 1:19 says, since what may be known about God is plain to them because God has made it plain to them. Okay? God has not hidden himself from man, but we suppress the truth about God. Romans 1:21 again says, although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. See, man became ignorant because of his rejection of his Creator. Man is smart in a lot of things, but they're ignorant towards his Creator. Remember how I was talking earlier about science and how we now know the universe had a beginning? And you'd think that would cause scientists that examine the universe to say, wow, isn't God great? But they don't want to admit that. So they come up with things like the multiverse, okay? And several other theories that can't be proven at all, just to keep from saying there's a creator. Yes, sir.
now you have to actually obey. If you ignore the fact that there is a God, you don't have to worry about all that stuff. And you can sin without any retribution, because in your mind, there's no God to consequence. But once you think that in your mind, there is God, a whole lot of other stuff that comes with it. It's what they don't want.
And that's why sin is the leading cause of atheism. Okay? It's not about knowledge. It's about sin. And if you don't believe in God, you can go out and live guilt-free any way you want to. Verse 19. He says, now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be silenced and the whole world held accountable to God. Okay, now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law. You know, this is a general principle about law that we're all familiar with. If you live in the United States, whose laws are you responsible for? Because we live under them, right? And we're under the jurisdiction, well, I can't say that word, can I? Of the United States. Okay, when I lived in Russia, guess what? I was under Russian law. 1 year, I found myself under both laws, United States and Russia. I had to pay income taxes to both countries 1 year. Okay, I lived there we lived there 6 years, and except we never paid income tax in Russia except for 1 year, and we got a call from the government saying, y'all have to pay taxes this year. The local tax office called us and told us that. Says Moscow says we got to collect. And so we went in and took everything. And you know, their income tax is a lot easier. You just take all your documents in, they fill out the forms and tell you how much you owe. And the next year rolls around. It didn't hear from the government, so we called them. Would you like for us to pay taxes this year? Well, you know, we've not heard from Moscow this year, and it's really a pain doing y'all's tax returns. So we'll call you. If Moscow decides you need to pay, we'll give you a call. So we only paid that 1 year in that. But when you live under laws, you obey those laws. You're responsible for them. And what happens if you disobey those laws? There's consequences. You find yourself before a judge, don't you? And then your life, your fate is in the hands of that judge. And so here when Paul says, we're talking about being under the law, the question is, which law is Paul speaking of? Is he speaking of the law of Moses, the law of Christ, the natural law that the Gentiles knew, or the law of sin and death? Which one do you think Paul's talking about here? How about all of them? He says, whichever law you're under, the Jews had the law of Moses. Were the Gentiles under the law of Moses? No. But they knew the natural laws, and they were under those. And all of them were under the law of sin and death. They all were responsible to them. So whatever law you live under, you are responsible. And Paul is telling them someday you're going to stand before God and be held accountable for the law you found yourself under. And then he says there in verse 19, so that every mouth may be silenced and the whole world held accountable to God. In other words, our guilt will be so established. You know, there's one thing when you go into a courtroom, you know, you got your defense attorney, and his job is to throw doubt on your guilt. Okay? Our sin is going to be so established that there's going to be no way you can discredit your guilt. That's what he's saying here in this, in that. In Psalm 51, it says that Jesus, when he was on trial, did not open his mouth in his defense. You know, we all know that in Psalm chapter 51, like a lamb before his shearer is silent. He did not open his mouth. Jesus, you ever wonder why Jesus was silent? Why he didn't defend himself? I mean, you could actually discredit the guilt that they're trying to throw upon him, because there was none, right? If anybody had a proper defense, it was Jesus. Yes, sir. Yeah, he was not silenced for himself. He was silenced for us. He was not standing there representing his guilt. He was standing there representing our guilt. And guess what? There's no defense for it. And so he stood there like a lamb, and he did not open his mouth. You know, no one, when we stand before God, will have an excuse. No one. Everyone's going to be held accountable for the sin in his life. This is what Paul is wanting the Gentiles to understand, and he wants the Jews to understand. You guys are guilty. Period. End of discussion. There's nothing else. Because if you don't understand that, you're not going to be able to understand the rest of what Paul is going to say in Romans. He's giving them the bad news. We live in a day and age where people don't want to hear the bad news. And I think this is what's wrong with a lot of Christians today. We don't understand the bad news. You got to understand the bad news before you can understand and appreciate the good news. Now, here at the end of chapter 3, he's going to start to get into the good news, and we'll start looking at that next week. But he wants us to understand first the bad news. And that is, on our own volition, we're guilty and we have no defense before God. That's sobering to think about, isn't it? And here in verse 20, he says, therefore, no one will be declared righteous in his sight by observing the law, whether through the law we become conscious of sin. No one will be declared righteous in his sight by observing the law. Paul can't state it any plainer than this right here. If you're trying to be justified because you're such a good person, you've already failed. See, that's the problem. Because you can't be good enough. And Paul is really wanting us to understand that in that. And if there's going to be any hope for any of us, we have to understand the bad news. Without Christ, without the grace of God, okay, we all stand condemned. That's the bottom line. We can't be saved based upon our performance. Our performance is not good enough. And see, as we've seen before, the law demands perfect obedience. Anybody here been perfectly obedient under your law? Anybody here ever sped when you're driving your car? Guilty. Just like that. Okay? He says, rather through the law we become conscious of sin. See, there is a purpose. The law was not given just to condemn us. Say, well, why did God even give us a law? Well, he didn't give it to us just to condemn us. The purpose of that law was to teach us two things. Number one, to know and understand what sin is. We need to know what sin is. And the second reason he gave us the law is to help us to see that we need help. We can't do it ourselves. Look at 3 verses here and then I'm done. Romans 7, verse 7. It says, what shall we say then? Is the law sin? In other words, is the law bad? Is another way of saying that. And Paul says, certainly not. Indeed, I would not have known what sin was except through the law. For I would not have known what coveting really was if the law had not said, do not covet. I got a question. If there was no law that said, do not covet, would be coveting, would it be okay then? Still wouldn't be okay, would it? Okay. We still would sin, right? Well, God gave the law so that we would know what sin was. Go to Galatians 3:19. Just read the first part of verse 19. He says, what then was the purpose of the law? It was added because of transgressions. God gave us the law because we were sinners, so that we would know what sin was. And look at Romans 5:20, first part of verse 20. The law was added so that the trespass might increase. In other words, the law was given to us so that we would know and understand sin. So, when we stand before God, we can't plead ignorance, can we? No, we can't do that. We might try to say a lot of things, but we can't say that because God has told us. We know deep in our hearts what sin is. And if you're honest with yourself, you know what your sin is. And so we all stand guilty before God. Every single one of us. And we can't understand the good news of the gospel until we understand this one point. You know what I think made Paul such a strong Christian in his life? He understood his sin. He understood what he had been doing to God prior to becoming a Christian. He knew there was no way he was going to make it to heaven. Sometimes I know I've struggled with them. I said, I'm such a good person, I wouldn't even have to become a Christian. We want to think that about ourselves. But it's not true. We're sinners. We're condemned. And we need to understand that before we can understand exactly what Jesus has done for us. Yeah. Paul knew who he was without Christ. And we need to know who we are without Christ. And when we understand that, I think we'll have a deeper appreciation for what Christ has done. And maybe, just maybe, when we take the Lord's Supper, there might be a tear in our eyes because it means something to us at that point in time. Okay, we're going to stop here, and we'll hopefully get to some good news next week. I don't like teaching bad news, okay?